Welcome once again to the Sci-Tech Asia webinar series. Welcome everyone, wherever you are. My name is Gonçalo Santos. I'm the director of Sci-Tech Asia, and I will also be the chair to today's session that will take us to Mumbai. And we have a wonderful paper that will look at the public policies of the fishing industry in India, and in particular in the city of Mumbai and its coastal environment. The speaker today is Dr. V. Chitra from the National University of Singapore. She's an anthropologist, and her research intersects environmental studies, STS, and visual studies. She is currently working on her first book, which is titled Drawing Coastlines, Climate Anxieties and the Visual Reinvention of Mumbai's Shore. I suppose that the research that she's going to present today is directly connected to this manuscript in progress. Chitra has a background in design in addition to anthropology in all the fields that I mentioned before, and she's interested in experimenting with comics as an ethnographic medium, and I think this is very, very interesting. Anyway, her talk today is entitled Terranean Coasts, Extractive Economies and Nearshore Worlds in Mumbai. Chitra, the floor is yours, please. You can share the screen if you want.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to meet this wonderful collective and this network and share my work. This is a great opportunity, Gonzalo. Thank you so much for arranging this. And I'm really excited to hear people's comments. As Gonzalo said, I am an anthropologist and I'm interested in STS, environmental studies and visual studies. And I come at anthropology through a background in design. And I'm just going to begin by sharing my screen and pre-apologizing for one thing, which is that I'm currently living with 2 dogs and they sometimes become very feisty. And so if suddenly they bark, I really do apologize and your understanding. So hopefully people can see my screen.
Yes, it's very clear. It's very clear.
Excellent. Please do let me know if there are any questions. I can also I can close this if required. There you go. And what I'll do is to open the chat window just in case anyone has a quick question. So, so my current project, which is the book project, looks at how techno-scientific images, graphs, plans, surveys, weather infographics shape how we understand and experience climate change and shape the landscapes we inhabit. Which is to say, I'm looking at how drawings, especially technical scientific drawings, are not just representations of change out there, but have social and material consequences and drive that change. And I'll explain what I mean through one set of techno-scientific images, the coastal plans for India's shoreline. And through this, I'll explain how a Terranean coast comes into being and how those drawings set in place extractive economies that are having a really bad effect on coastal ecologies and on nearshore economies. So the other thing I do want to flag is that I work with drawings, particularly comics. And so the slides that you see are those, because the book that I'm working on is half comic, half text. And so the slides you see today are also from that book and that particular chapter that I want to share with you. So here we go. So in the early hours of July 31, 2012, the inhabitants of Moragaon, a fishing village in Mumbai, were wakened by the looming presence of MV Pavit, a 77-meter-long oil tanker. The Coast Guard cast the event as a breach of national security and promised more rigorous marine patrols. For Mumbai's nearshore fishery community, the Coalies, This meant heightened surveillance of coastal waters, increased control over boat licenses, and there was the danger that Pavit would move with the tide and crash into the village. Events like a beach tanker and governmental responses to it are windows into the fundamental disjuncture between nearshore fishing and contemporary coastal management. Their divergences are their divergences are most apparent in the agency they confer to the non-humans of the shoreline. For instance, while the fisher community saw Pavit, this tanker, as an agent that caused a chain of reactions within a web of socio-economic and ecological relationships, the state government treated it as an agent that had breached a line, crossing into India's territorial waters. So the question I want to begin with is, how do lines appear on the shore, on water, and how do these lines then remake coastal realities? Is everyone able to hear me clearly? In case you aren't, please use the chat box to please let me know. So this understanding of breached lines is the direct consequence of India's Coastal Regulatory Zone Policy, or CRZ as it is called, and it organizes the coast as a bounded territorial unit where resources can be mobilized, borders can be secured. Since the coastal policy is fundamentally about controlling space, cartographic drawings, maps and plans are vital for implementing this policy. So the visual control over the visual control in creating these plans and maps allows the government to implement growth-based policies in a tightly managed space, which simplify fluid and complex relationships that sustain vibrant communities and small-scale economies. And these are like then turned to serve extractive economies. And I'll get into that. And that is done by first fixing the tide as a line. And I'll explain what I mean by that. For example, to implement the CRZ, one of the most important things that needs to happen is to demarcate the high tide line. So if you have something like the coast, right, and now this coast has to become a governable zone, the first thing that the policy has to actually decide is really what is the coast? Where does the coast begin and end? And, so for that, it takes the high tide line as a central line in relation to which it defines the boundaries of the coast, okay? And so the extent of the coast and the zones, its subzones, which are some zones where certain kinds of construction is permitted, other zones where ecological conservation happens, all of these other zones, subzones inside of it, are only comprehensible in relation to this line. So this is this line. And so what I've done in this is to basically draw a schematic diagram in comic format of the first version of this policy, which was released in 1991. So if you have this line, which is the high tide line, which is derived by looking at satellite maps and by going and doing ground truth surveys and by taking tide data, then what is decided in relation to it is the landward extent of the coast and the seaward extent of the coast, which is the low tide line. So it's always the lowest low tide line over 10 years and the highest high tide spring tide line over 10 years. That is then used to determine the extent of the coast. From 1991, when the first CRZ policy was released, the landward extent of the coast was simply offset from the high tide line as a parallel line at a distance of 500 meters. So if you can see, this line, which is the landward extent of the coast, is simply a copy of this line, and it's pushed by 500 meters to determine that, okay, this is the landward extent of the coast. This manner of identifying the CRZ does not take into account any land features such as mountains or cliffs. So suppose there was a mountain here and you can see there's a little creek here. It doesn't take any of these things into account, but simply denotes the high tide line as a line that is traced on a cartographic map as from a bird's eye view. Now, subsequent policies, and this is the 2011 policy, so 20 years after the first one was released, have kept the high tide line as the main line that determines the landward extent of the coast. But if you have sharp eyes, you will see that the number of zones and subzones have increased. So which means that the coast is further and further atomized into further, into smaller and smaller subzones to make management happen at a higher resolution, at a much immediately perceivable scale. So instead of like having broad policies that take large regions into account, then suddenly things like, okay, policies for very small fishing villages are separate, there are turtle breeding grounds, and all of this is also possible because technology is changing. Between 1991 and 2011, you now have very high resolution satellite maps available, which allows for coastal management to take on such a granular form. And this has consequences for the coast. So the 2018 policy, and this is a new one, it was so granular that I couldn't draw it in the same way. So what I've done is to basically give you a chart of all of the smaller subzones in it. The 2018 CRZ notification too follows this convention, where the landward edge of the coastal zone is simply offset from the high tide line. For the most part, high and low tide lines are established by examining high resolution satellite imagery along with bathymetric and tidal records. However, with each iteration, as you can perhaps tell from these drawings, the number of subdivisions has multiplied. The CRZ policy assumes that the availability of high resolution surveys makes the process of drawing the coast incredibly straightforward. So you see it on the map, and if you see it on the ground, then that's it, that's a one-to-one relationship. And that given the advancement in survey technology, satellite images can provide an accurate and immediate picture of the coast. This creates the sense that the coast is at once comprehensible and increasingly divisible to a greater and greater degree. And this is from my ethnographic work with government surveyors as they went and they surveyed the coast to determine exactly where the high tide line should be mapped. And then they were determining where the coast begins and ends. So this accuracy and immediacy is directly linked to new forms of extractive environmental regimes because it allows the eye to atomize the coast as a bundle of resources and a site of fixed potential. So now I'm going to go into my work with nearshore fisher communities who have a completely different relationship with the shore. So during 2011 and 2012, I was doing fieldwork in Mumbai's fishing communities among families engaged in nearshore fishing in a village called Maloni. So I needed to contextualize this at the beginning of the talk, but allow me to do it now. Most of this work that I'm describing is taking place on the western coast of India, in a city called Mumbai that maybe all of you are familiar with, but this is where this is happening. And it's a very dense and populous city. And because this new policy had come into place in 2011, it portended a lot of changes for the city's small-scale fisher community. So I was looking at how does this policy and the ways in which it draws the coast plays out in the lives of nearshore fisher communities. So I was doing my work in a village called Maloni, which is to the north of the city. Unlike the CRZ, nearshore, which is the coastal policy, nearshore fishing takes the coast as a fluid entity, which is sustained by complex interdependencies between humans and non-humans. And I suggest this particular way of looking at the coast as a fluid space offers an opening to see and draw the coast differently and offers an incredibly sharp critique of the extractive eye of the coastal policy. So nearshore fishing involves a number of improvisational moves that happen in close association with the coast, especially the creek. The creek, an inlet of water where the sea slips into the landmass and where fresh water from lakes and runoffs fall into the sea, is an extremely important element in fishing and coastal life. The beginning and end of the fishing season is marked by changes in the creek's behavior as it churns with the monsoon and is quieted with the rains. And this way of reading the creek is vital for sustaining small-scale economies, to look at the color of the water, to look at the way the wind is moving the water. All of these things are incredibly vital to the kinds of decisions that go into the everyday practices of fishing. The behavior of the creek is also a sign to determine the depth at which to fish. And as the creek and the seawater are thought of as a mixture that is either stirred or still. To the fishers, creeks, estuaries, and bays offer a measure of protection from the direct action of the sea, places to park their boats, dry their fish, and in times when the sea is rough, a place to fish. And one of the interesting consequences of the coastal regulatory policy is that it has allowed for a lot of public interventions at the coast. So the city's coast is now reimagined as a recreational space. And because instead of imagining it as a site of work that nearshore fisher communities engage in, if it is imagined as a space of recreation, oftentimes the interventions that take place are actually quite harmful for even everyday actions like where to park a fishing boat. Given how fishers actively shape the creek and are shaped by it, so their actions also shape the creek, the creek can be thought of as a milieu in which uncertainties, rhythms, risks, and the possibilities of fishing circulate. The CRZ completely overlooks this point as it posits an unchanging relationship between fishers and the coastal landscape, that lines once set are then describe exactly what activities or what relationships can occur within those lines. So it assumes that the creek has an integral, unchanging form, and its plans end up creating a Terranean shore. So instead of looking at it as a fluid space, it ends up creating a space where things are attended to in a rather solid and fixed way. And one of the ways in which it happens is because the coast itself is thought of as a space that can be divided, controlled, and appropriated using the forms of governing land. So surveying, mapping, all of these are taken from systems of governing land and imposed onto the coast. So such a landward understanding of the shore comes out of long histories of surveying and drawing that reappropriate and render the fluid coastal worlds as property. So thinking of the coast as property is actually vital to the reordering that is taking place along the city's shore. So an important outcome of this Terranean reordering is that it turns the coast into bounded areas that can be disciplined to prevailing policy perspectives. And so now I'm going to explain how these prevailing policy perspectives actually impose growth-based economies onto this controlled space. As far as policies that concern Indian fisheries grow, their outlook has always been growth-oriented. The bounded areas in the CRZ become the basis for calculating the potential of the fisheries industry, which is often described as a sunrise sector with boundless capacity for growth. So one of the interesting calculations that happens is that one of the interesting calculations that goes into the CRZ is that calculating the area of the continental shelf. And here I'm just giving you an example of the kinds of calculi that move this extractive economy, which is that, okay, so when the continental shelf area of the continental shelf is calculated, then the policies the fisheries industry policies basically take that area to calculate what might be the amount of catch that might be available to Indian fisher communities. And then they say that, well, there is X million tons of catch available, but look, we're only taking 40% of X. So therefore, there is all of this potential out there that we're not tapping. And so the fisheries economy is really based on this idea that there is more and more fish out there to be fished. So these policies are informed by a long-held belief that there is a lot more fish out there than is captured annually. So from independence onwards, where there's this idea of there is this nation that needs to be fed. There's a long history of programs where the government has really put a lot of money behind trying to get large-scale intensive forms of fishing into the fisheries sector. This is a legacy of the first Blue Revolution that began in the 1950s when the Indian government initiated a large-scale program to modernize fishing boats and to increase the annual fishing yield. So as you can see, so with these programs, what has happened is that the annual fishing yield has grown every year since every decade since the first blue revolution. This trend has continued in recent policies, which promotes intensive fishing practices such as trawler fishing and more recently inland farming. So the second blue revolution just concluded in 2015. And what happened was that while the previous blue revolutions focused on the kinds of gear, so giving farmers mechanized craft, introducing trawlers, introducing technologies like purse seine netting, which takes a huge amount of catch in one go. Now, the new policies are looking towards inland fishing, which also has a devastating consequence on the coast. So recently, inland fishing, despite evidence of increasing stress on fish stock, so fish stock are dying out, but intensive practices continue. And that is because that the prevailing calculi that there is more fish out there seems to be the overarching narrative that refuses to budge. This has hit community-based small-scale fishers the most, pushing them into continuing cycles of debt and poverty. Policies like the Second Blue Revolution, which was launched in 2015 by the Department of Fisheries, translate the area of fishing zones into potential catch, the number that is supposed to grow steadily year upon year. And this number is projected at 8%. Now, how did they manage to reach 8% remains a mystery to me. But the idea is that if the fisheries economy grows by 8% every year, that is thought to be sustainable. However, what remains missing from these narratives is at what point does this growth stop? That is not clear. So this is most apparent in the graphs that are published both at the center and the state level. Year after year, this graph is expected to maintain its upward trend. As this graph follows its vertical trajectory, it undoes the complex human-non-human relationships that sustain small-scale nearshore fishing communities and fishing economies. Because they are less intensive, small-scale fishing practices bring in a smaller total annual yield. So let me give you a sense of how small-scale fishing is. In the fishing season between 2010 and 11, nearly 500,000 tons of fish were caught in the state of Maharashtra. This number has since, of course, increased drastically. Of this, 143,000 tons of fish were caught along the shores of Mumbai, which accounts for just under 30% of the state's total production. And Maharashtra is not a leading state in the fisheries economy. The small cluster of fishing villages where I did my fieldwork, it's a little group of like 3 or 4 villages, accounts for just under 3% of the state's yearly catch. So it's a very, very, very small number that we're talking when compared to intensive fishing practices like trawler fishing. So according to the Maharashtra State Department's fisheries estimate, each mechanized boat, which is the boat that the small scale fishers used, which I kind of showed you in this picture. Let me just go back to it. This is a mechanized boat. It has a crew of about 5 people, and it's about I would say about 8 to 10 meters long. So each of these boats makes an average of 91 efforts in a year. So an effort is every time that a fisher puts the nets into the water and hauls it back. That is called an effort. So each mechanized boat makes an average of 91 efforts in a year. So this means that a boat is only going out once in every 3 days. Now, there are 2 ways to read this particular statistic. It can be taken as the government does, as a sign of lack, that, small scale fishing is not a viable practice, it's unsophisticated or traditional, and I'm using air quotes here, and it's not conducive to economic growth. And this is the line that the government takes, which is why it doesn't offer as much, like the subsidies it offers for small scale fishing are far less compared to what it offers for trawler fishing or purse seine netting or inland fisheries now. So it can be taken as a sign of lack, It can bring home the precarious lives that small-scale fishers lead and the tight margins in which they operate, since each mechanized vessel only ventures out once in 3 days, and makes it all the more important to maximize the potential of every catch. Those are the ways to, maybe to think about it. But there is another way to think about this statistic, and which is to think of it as an inherent aspect of small-scale fishing. That is not a sign of lack, but it's really an outcome of design. Unlike the coast as a zone of quantified potential, small-scale fishers create the coast through interdependencies that work in the long and short term. This should not be taken to mean that small-scale fishing lacks technological or economic sophistication, or that numbers and quanta are irrelevant. They're very, very much relevant. Instead, it should be taken to mean that the ways in which small-scale fishing organizes the coast makes it far more sustainable in the long term. And I'm drawing from works of anthropologists like Amelia Moore, who point out that, it's not just that there are fish out there, but really fisheries and the coast itself is really an outcome of design. And it exists, the fishers and the fish exist in a mutual relationship. So hopefully what this example gives you is a good sense of the larger projects of how the drawings manifest as shore. And basically what I would like to do through this project is to follow a folk path, which is to kind of show how ideas of objectivity, accuracy, and simultaneity that are central to technoscientific images, such as coastal plans, and their developmental outcomes get muddled as land, water, humans, and more than human worlds mix at the shore. And what I would like to do and conclude my talk with is basically to think about how the ways we draw end up producing these socio-material realities that then structure coastal worlds for humans and non-humans of the shoreline. And I'm going to stop here and take questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chitra, for your questions. Well, as I noted in the chat box, so those of you that would like to take questions or to ask questions to the speaker, you can do so by pressing the button for the raising the hand function if you want to ask your question orally. Or else, if you want to do it in writing, you could perhaps just write your question directly in the chat box. Well, while the members of the audience perhaps think about a possible question to ask you, I'd like to ask you a preliminary clarifying question, because your slides were incredibly rich, very beautiful. Stunning, the cartoons in particular, but they were also very much packed with sort of information, right? And I wonder if we could go back to this first set of slides that you showed us about the mapping plans and the various zones that were defined. Could you explain us a little bit more about how it works? This dividing lines, and what exactly were the motivations? I mean, you mentioned motivations of economy, but I was also wondering about environmental concerns, whether these are coming into play in the dividing lines. Could you explain us a little bit more how it works in Mumbai?
Yes, that's a great question. And I wanted to keep it short so that I could have a conversation. And I'm very happy you're asking me this question. So it really started with this letter that was written by Indira Gandhi in 1981. And I have not been able to find an actual copy of this letter, but it is stated in all these policies as the genesis of the coastal law. And the letter is quite interesting because it talks about how India needs to be cognizant of the environmental degradation that's happening along the coastal line, one, and two, to the kind of damage that or the kind of harm that low income communities of the coast face. That actually was the backbone of the policy. And which is why if you look at the first iteration of this policy, it is
So,
in fact,
sorry, this was when the letter?
the letter was written in 1981 to all the coast.
1981.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And then the first policy was passed in 1991. So one decade after
Okay.
Indira Gandhi's letter. So interestingly, if you look at this particular policy, what it says is that the coast goes between the lowest low tide line and 500 meters from the highest high tide line. And what it actually does is imposes a huge number of developmental restrictions. That was actually the first iteration of the policy. And because once this policy was released, in cities like Mumbai, where the real estate prices are very high, people could not construct things along the shore where the land prices are very high. And so that was really the status quo. And so the CRZ was supposed to have this kind of protection-oriented outlook. But then in 2011, that changed because what happened was, to understand how the 2011 policy changed, I have to remind you of the 2004 tsunami. The 2004 tsunami hit, and at that time when the 2004 tsunami hit, there was a committee that was sitting to revise the policy. And they were very much influenced by this disaster. And what they found was that, well, what happened because of this disaster is that a lot of informal communities were actually, very badly affected by it. And so they came up with this idea that they needed to protect the rights of traditional fisher communities, and also give informal communities living along the city's urban edges of the country, some measure of like developmental rights or access to better housing, which they could not do under the older policy because construction was not allowed along the coast. So suddenly you have this in 2011, an opening up of coastal land for development. And that is really where the problem comes in. And from here onwards, what has happened is a steady removal of any kind of environmental oversight. So from there, we have gone into this, where each part can be measured. You can kind of say, oh, here the turtle breeds here, so let me cordon off this little area for environmental conservation, but we can mine here. So that is really what has happened. So hand in glove with technology is changing, you have a far more extractive regime coming into place, even if it seems like, they're talking about turtle breeding grounds and they're talking about where should flamingos be. But the problem is that it talks about it in a way which atomizes the coast further and further and doesn't allow for those fluid movements to happen. So suddenly now turtles are bounded within this 50 square meter area, or flamingos are on this one particular creek. And so, but the coast doesn't work that way, is the point. And this is why those lines and drawing how those lines come about becomes such an important exercise. I hope that I answered that question.
No, yes, absolutely. Yes, that's very, that clarifies a lot. But are there any fishing quotas I understand that you seem to have mentioned two kinds of fishing in the capture fisheries sector. So the small scale artisanal sort of fishing, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, and then on the other hand, the more industrial
Yes.
kind of fishing. So are there fishing quotas for these two kinds of fishing in
No,
Mumbai?
there aren't quotas per se, but now there are new license regimes that are coming into force. So that is how catch is controlled. There are no quotas because there's the idea that one has to extract more and more, that there is the potential. So at this moment, there are no question of quota at all. But that is a problem, because small scale fishers are now saying that if you actually give people with trawlers such subsidies or purse seine netters, what's happening is that trawlers and purse seine netters take up whole populations of fish. So there's no juvenile fish left for the next season. And combined with the pollution load that comes in from cities like Mumbai, and Pune to the north, and or even Karachi, like the entire that entire area becomes of the Arabian Sea becomes almost a dead zone. So already there's a lot of pressure on this space, and the policy really doesn't do anything to help either. But what becomes contentious here is control over land, because the fisher communities who are now, seeing that, okay, they can develop their own villages which is inside these zones, which were not open to development before, suddenly are like, well, what if a developer comes in and develops our land and displaces us? So we need to have developmental rights. So in this entire worry over land rights, what ends up happening is that the longer term environmental discourse or any kind of horizon kind of slips out of the conversation. Rightly so, because people are worried about where are they going to live. Yeah.
Yeah, but you mentioned there are new licensing regimes, right? And what do you mean by that?
So this is a little bit, I'm going to have to get back to you on that particular one, because this has just been introduced. Been introduced. So there's a bunch of changes under the 2019 policy that I kind of have to go back and look and tell you. But there are now, because of the kinds of, like expansion of where you can fish, there are these new boat licenses that are being introduced, which are also becoming, which become a form of control. I'm going to have to get back to you on that one, but that is the way the government controls boating and fish catch.
Okay, and so since there are no fishing quotas, that supposedly means that people can freely sell basically whatever they want and how they want it. So how are they taxed, for example? Are they taxed at all, small scale fishers?
Well, they would be taxed as in terms of income, right? But you're looking at really low income families here.
Okay.
So in a lot of cases, they may not even meet those tax criteria. You're looking at really, really low income community here. It's not unlike trawler fishing, which would then become almost like a company, like an enterprise, which then would be taxed as a business. So this is not the same.
But are they, so trawler fishing, are they taxed on the basis of what they catch, or are they taxed on the basis of a sort of an estimate?
They're taxed on the basis of their income, so they have to report income. Just like, in a business, they wouldn't report. Right. The catch is only taken for census purposes.
I see. Okay. Yeah. So I don't know if the members of the audience would like to ask a question to Chitra. If you want to know anything about capture fisheries in India, and more specifically in Mumbai, this is a great opportunity to ask a question.
Or about drawings and anthropology.
What about drawings and anthropology? Absolutely.
Hi.
Hi.
Yes, I do have a question. So yeah, I was wondering why you choose comics instead of the other like multimodal ways to present this. What's the consideration behind?
Oh, sorry. Can you introduce yourself? I'm very sorry.
Yeah,
I can't see you.
Yeah, I'm Yi Chen. I am also one of the members of the Sci-Tech Asia Network. I'm currently based in University of Michigan as a postdoc in anthropology, and I study financial technologies in China. So not exactly, familiar with fisheries, but I've been, exploring ways of having multimodal collaborations with people. So I was really curious of why, because these are very, it reminds me of some of the very nice ways to communicate sciences to people. But I wonder why choose this instead of the others.
Yeah. No, that's a great question, and it has a very simple answer, but a simple answer and a kind of little bit long-winded. So please bear with me. The first thing is that I came to anthropology with a background in drawing. I actually didn't train as an anthropologist before I drew. So I drew before. studied architecture, then I studied illustration and graphic design and experimental animation. And I decided that I was going to be a comic book artist. And then I spent a year with a studio and I was drawing comic books, and then I didn't like how I was drawing and I wanted to draw research-based comic books. So I ended up in an anthropology program. Then I didn't draw, and now I've started drawing again. So it took a long way of coming into drawing, then coming into reading and writing, and then finally trying to put them together. The reason why I think this project needs to be drawn is also, there are two reasons. The first is that in Mumbai, a lot of spatial politics happens through the visual. So cinema, plans, all of even weather infographics become very, very important instruments in shaping spatial politics in the city. So in a way, it's also a way of engaging the politics on ground in the language in which it is conducted. So that's also a kind of inroads into it. The third answer is quite simply, I find it very useful as a method to take the drawing, whatever the government drawing is, to redraw it, like I do over here, as a method of showing the ways in which ideas of objectivity or lines or zones end up working on ground. I find that to be a very productive enterprise. How that will parlay into the next project, I don't know, but I hope to keep drawing.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that is really wonderful.
I would also have a question.
Thank you, and Simone, please.
Yes.
Introduce yourself, please, in the beginning.
Yes. I'm Simona. I come from Romania. I'm a cultural anthropology graduate with a background in theater and arts. So I would actually, I'm actually very excited about what you do, and I would like to combine more visual arts with ethnography. And your drawings are amazing. I love them. I love that you combine so much information. You packed it in those pages, and it's also aesthetically pleasing and easy to understand. I would love to read your book.
Thank you.
And maybe I will send you an email to ask you about how it's accessible and everything.
Please, yes, please do. It's currently under review with Cornell University Press. So hopefully it comes out quickly. But I'll be very happy to talk with you anytime. Any of you, if you want to talk to me, please shoot me an email. I'm very friendly. Yes, please ask your question.
Yes, of course. I was very curious if you showed your book or the drawings to the people that you interviewed, to the people that you did ethnography with, and how was it received? Because it's so much easier to show a visual product than, a written article or something that maybe would not be so easily understood.
Yeah. So in this form, no. So in this particular form, the final drawings, the kind of very polished format, no, because I just finished it in the last 2 years. So I actually didn't get to go home to, yes, in the earlier draft formats, like the earlier sketch drawings that I was doing, a lot of the drawings actually come from the drawing in the field. So I'd go and sit with my sketchbook and just draw. And so that became ground for more drawings later. I've also done, some presentations in Mumbai which were attended by representatives from the fisher community. But unfortunately, for instance, I did a lot of, during a lot of my fieldwork, I used to work sorting and selling fish for a long time, because that was the way to kind of talk about land and things and stuff. And only men go on boats. Women sort and sell fish. So I only went on the boats 3 times throughout the year. And most of the time I was sitting there and sorting and selling fish. So it was all women. And unfortunately, the women actually that I worked with have not really seen the images in this format. They've seen on my phone, I've talked to them and stuff like that. But beyond that, no, because they aren't attending these presentations. So hopefully, yeah, if I go back and I get a chance to share it again, then definitely. But this is also a community, interestingly, because they're locked in a battle, right, for their land rights. This is also a community that also archives and collects a lot of information. So anytime anything is published on the fisher community, they'll collect it. So chances are like, even scientific articles are collected, they're kept because they can be used for, to make certain kinds of political articulations and claims in court, especially to say that, look, this is established as a fishing village in this study. So therefore it is a fishing village. So give us some land rights and, things like that. So in a way, like the information as it circulates does make its way back. So on, through the channels through which we access information, which is basically the internet, I suppose. Yeah.
All right, thank you. I'm very curious to see in the future if you manage to show your book. I think the response will be amazing.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.
Good luck.
Thanks. I'm still drawing a couple of the bits, so yeah, hopefully soon.
Nice.
Hello, can I ask a question? Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Jun. I'm currently at City University of Hong Kong, also a member of Sci-Tech Asia. Thank you very much for the talk. It was a great talk. It's really informational, and yeah, I love drawing too, especially when I don't know how to draw myself. So my question actually is something about the fishing, especially the small scale fishing. Because the issue of fishing obviously has caught a lot of attentions, and most of the things that I read regarding the large, big commercial, highly industrialized fishing, especially those sales in the, I think, special economic zones or the public oceans, large scales, people stay on boats for months and months and never go home. And of course, recently, I think there's several incidents that caught international attention because of the death, the abuse of fishermen, and so on and so forth. So on that, we sort of get a little bit sense what's happening, but I'm actually quite curious about what you talk about the small scale fishing, the fishing villages, as you said. It's not that they are less sophisticated, the lack of technology or anything like that. But in general, my understanding, obviously very superficial, is fishing is a rather highly risky business in comparison to agriculture. I'm not saying agriculture is much safer, but their fishing seems to be subjected to different kinds, for example, the shipwreck, which will be a big cost. The weather forecast is quite, matters a lot. And of course, climate matters a lot. So I'm thinking, actually, then how does that work economically for local livelihood, for, people who relies on that? And you mentioned about women usually not allowed on boat, which I think I read something a while back in China, very similar. But there is a gender labor divisions, and women staying at home tend to do a little bit more farming as a way to sort of provide a little bit income, while men actually sales outside and so on and so forth. So I'm just curious, want to know a little bit more about those small scale fishing, how the divisions of labor, how, seasonal, is it a seasonal divide, how it collaborate, just get a little bit more sense how it is, the kind of a everyday life is like for this small scale.
Absolutely,
fishing.
that's great. So in terms of the gender division of labor, that's actually, it is a problem, because in the sense that, then basically men go out, they come back, then the women go and they sell the fish, but then the household economy is mostly controlled by the guy, right? So there is all of this kind of patriarchal systems that are built into it. And like, when I would ask, like, why don't women go on the boats? And they do go, like, recreationally, they might go out. The reason that's given is like, so these boats go out for 8 hours a day. And I'll explain how the process works. But there's no toilet on the boats, right? So there is no way for, like, you have to, if you go on the boat, you have to hold the bladder, and the boat is sacred, so you can't pee on the boat. That's not, it's kind of considered a no-no. So guys can pee off of the boat, but women end up having to pee in a bucket, and all of these things happen. So that was one of the primary reasons that I was discouraged from going on the boat, which is not to say that is the reason why women do not go on the boat. But because there are these long-standing patriarchal systems that have like, that divide, labor in that way, and in some sense, also allow those configurations to persist. So, and the other thing is, so in terms of how this works, so these boats, basically, it's not really the boat itself, it is the net that has to be understood. This net, the particular net that they use is called a bag net. And this bag net, basically, it's put into the water and it stays afloat with the force of the tide. And interestingly enough, and this also kind of speaks to Gonzalo's question of how does control happen, who gets to fish what. The small scale fishers are not peripatetic. They don't go around trying to find fish. Here the sea is divided and kind of there's a marine tenure system in place. So each boat has a particular spot where it is allowed to fish. And these spots are marked by buoys. And each boat will have 3 buoys. One at say 5 fathoms, one at 7 fathoms, and one at 10 fathoms depth. Depending on the force of the wind and the tide that day, they choose one of the buoys to go and fish. So they'll tie the bag net to that buoy, and then the bag net will unfurl, and the fish will kind of move with the tidal action, and then they'll haul the nets in once the tide starts turning. So you just let it afloat. And basically they let it afloat, and then they start, like, they have lunch or they sleep a little, and then they haul the things in, and then they go back. So interestingly enough, India has semi-diurnal tides, which basically means you get 2 sets of high and low tides every day. And both those sets are not equal. One set is more sharper than the other. So you want to go out in the sharper time when the tidal difference is very high. So then the force of the water is also high. And this also changes with the month, right? Month, because of the lunar cycle, you have tidal variations. There are times in the month when the tide is very strong, and then there are times in the month when the tide is very low. So you don't want to go when the tide is very low, because your nets will sag and the fish won't go in. It'll just be a waste of petrol. So there are all of these reasons, and it is quite risky. And it is unsustainable. So most people, unsustainable in the sense that economically not becoming viable as the only profession that a family might be engaged in. So people are now turning to renting out homes, they work on cruise ships. But one of the reasons why it is unsustainable or unviable economically is also because if trawler fishing is so encouraged and it brings in all this catch and it's sold for so cheap in the market, then small scale fishers who are actually fishing with fish cycles end up getting shut out of that market. So mostly these cater to domestic markets, whereas trawler fishers will cater to export markets. And then now there's exported fish coming in, which you can very easily buy from a cold storage type space, and it'll be frozen and it's really cheap. So these kinds of structural issues actually make small scale fishing unviable, not the practice itself. If that helps.
Yeah, great. Thank you. It's fascinating to know about actually that side of how the technique side, how they use the nets, and it's fascinating. Thank you very much.
I don't know if anybody would like to ask any more questions. I have 2 more questions to ask, but
Please.
yes, but I wonder if someone else would like to join the conversation. Well, while perhaps you think about asking a question to Chitra via the chat block, the chat box, if you prefer, I'll ask a couple of questions. I was very intrigued, in fact, fascinated by, it seemed to me one of the main arguments that you develop in this presentation is a contrast between what you call the extractive eye and the extractive logic of public policies of coastal development and regulation of the capture fisheries sector, right? Which to some extent, it seemed to me that it overlaps with the highly industrialized sector in the the capture fisheries business, what you call trawler fishing, basically.
Yeah.
There seems to be an overlap between public policies and the focus on growth, development, and so on and so forth, and obviously the focus on growth and profit of trawler fishing companies. And on the other hand, what you at points in your presentation referred to as an alternative conceptualization of ways of relating to to marine ecosystems, to the ocean in general, which you referred to as a more fluid sort of conceptualization. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about this fluid conceptualization and why you think it might help us point the way to a more sustainable way of conceiving precisely our relationship to the ocean, because I really think it's very powerful and intriguing, and to some extent it sort of echoes the research that I'm doing here in Europe, a very different context with small scale fishing, because I really think we're converging in that respect. I think there's something to be learned by these vulnerable communities.
Yeah. So that's really that goes to the core argument itself, which is that so one of the ways in which the coastal policies distribute rights is by they give land rights to those who can qualify as artisanal fishers, as traditional fishers.
Right.
And this is seen as like this is good that they're conferring these rights to communities. But the problem is, then it also traps them in this romanticized identity of what is artisanal, that artisanal means certain kinds of practices, artisanal means that a community looks a certain way, is not technologically advanced. So all of these things come with that kind of political articulation, which is also then tied up with identity politics and indigenous rights in the city. And I can talk more about that. And this is really what I want to critique, which is that we need to break away from this idea that artisanal fishing is this kind of object that needs to be, its culture, its heritage or tradition, but unchanging, and therefore we can just keep it like a museum piece and then do all of this extractive stuff here. And so artisanal in a way is going to die out, is going to change, because it's not a practice that it's a practice from time before. But whereas what I want to say when I say fluid is to really and this is what I do in the chapter because I didn't have time to explain it, but I really do lay out how this fishing works and why it is that going out once in 3 days is not because they don't want to go and fish and don't want to make money, but it really works with the kinds of cycles of nearshore waters. And maybe what needs to happen is that, and I think Julie Cruikshank has written about this as well, where a lot of times these policies will say, okay, we'll kind of, gesture to indigenous communities and say, okay, we'll call you and you tell us your suggestions. And the policy is framed anyway. So this kind of knowledge is always taken as secondary to scientific knowledge. Whereas if we were to kind of think of scientific knowledge, it as a science, rather than it as tradition or heritage, then it changes the kinds of scores that, the ways in which one set of knowledge works in relation to the other. Whereas we can say, okay, fine, what kinds of sustainable pictures does it present? What kind of ecologies does it create? And those are very different questions. And if taken that way, it leads to very different kinds of policies. So that's really where the fluidity comes. And if that is taken seriously, then this idea that you create a high tide line and then offset 500 meters and call that the end of the shore just would not happen. That's really I think the path I'm trying to chart.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I have another question, perhaps a multi-species question. It's inevitable.
Yes.
since one of the key actors that we are talking about here is underwater, the fish.
Yeah.
So can the fish population speak, right? And whether you've been engaging with that kind of approaches as well. I mean, have you been trying to bring forth the views of the fish populations in the coastal areas of Mumbai, given that, in light of what you told us about developments from 2011 forward, we might be actually talking about an ecological disaster in the making in Mumbai.
Yeah,
Right.
well, it's not in the making. It's definitely already
Definitely
made. And
there.
what we're seeing
Okay.
is the long edge of extinction that will happen over millennia, right? No, I don't do it in this particular chapter. What I do, so there are moments where, the multi-species comes through, where, for instance, and it comes through in every chapter. For instance, when I'm talking about how government drawings are drawn, things like plants, sand, all of these non-human elements, actually, the policy does confer agency. For instance, the high tide, how would you know where the high tide line is? It is identified through plants. And oftentimes, non-humans don't behave in the way that policies envision that they behave. But to give you a very concrete example of how I do it, is I followed around this group called Marine Life of Mumbai, and there are a bunch of marine life enthusiasts, and they're different. So what they do is they lead public walks along the city's shoreline. They point to sea creatures and say, look, there is life here. This is not a dead zone. You share this city with all these marine creatures. You need to really be cognizant of the fact that humans are not the only residents of this city. And what they encourage people to do is to take photographs, build an archive online that reproduces the language of scientific archives. But it's supposed to do something else. It's supposed to kind of create, in that encounter, in that visual encounter, create a multi-species relationship between the human and the marine creature. And this has done a lot of work in terms of bringing awareness and getting people to think about, what does it mean to exist in a more than human world? But unfortunately, it's also, even as it brings this awareness, there are ways in which developmental horizons seem to persist, and we cannot let go of them. I'll give you a very good example. Along the western coast of Mumbai, they're constructing this freeway. Okay, it's an 8-lane expressway that will serve cars, and the logic is that, okay, then if cars go at 90 kilometers per hour, pollution will be less. Weird logic. And that has devastated the marine ecology along the shoreline, and the fisher community, environmental activists, everybody is militating against it. There was a marine survey that found the presence of coral colonies. Now, corals are a protected creatures under the Wildlife Act. And that is why these corals were able to momentarily stop a very large project. But then the Supreme Court stepped in and said the coral colonies are so small that public transport needs outweigh the needs of a coral colony. And so then the coral colony was hammered away. Somebody went and they basically created a coral relocation project, just like they relocate slum dwellers and informal settlements. So it's a kind of mirroring of the human, what happens to informal settlements to the coral colony. And I don't know the fate of that coral colony, but there are many ways in which the non-human works in at least this work. And unfortunately, it's as much as like they kind of do make you think about how do we draw differently, that we produce different courses? How do we think about time differently? How do we move away from developmental horizons to horizons of the more than human? More often than not, they do not come to bear. And that is really the frustration of it, right? That they don't come to bear.
So I understand there's a lot of growing environmental activism as well in Mumbai in relationship, in particular to the marine coastal environment.
Yeah.
So you mentioned one organization. Are they becoming more and more visible in the public culture and in the public sphere?
Yeah, it is. But the unfortunate problem is that Mumbai is also a city where, there are 22 million people in a very small space. And so the argument that goes is that Mumbai is already urban. So why are we expected to conserve natural environment in a place that is not natural? And,
Right.
in a place, so it's the logics of it becomes, it's confounding. It is confounding and it's hard. It is very hard. I mean, for the fisher communities themselves, faced with the prospect of losing their home versus saying, look, there is long-term ecological damage, they have to kind of work with the policy. Their stance can't be one of just resistance. They have to take the, whatever profit the policy offers so that they can secure, their right to housing. And so there are a lot of things that just slip away out of this conversation.
Chitra, one final question that I'm curious of. We've been talking mostly about Mumbai, right? And of course, India is a gigantic country with a very long coastal line, right?
Yeah.
Would you say that the developments that you described in Mumbai reflect larger developments that are going on across the coast of India, or would you say that it's a very specific, it's more specific? There are some strong Mumbai specificities. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Yep.
Well, the narrative is Mumbai specific, but really what it speaks to and the argument it makes and the kinds of developments it talks about are definitely generalizable. This is not happening just in Mumbai. Like the CRZ policy itself is a national policy. So it's really affecting all cities across on the coast. For instance, Chennai is a very good example. Chennai is also, changing very rapidly and has the same kind of flooding problems that Mumbai has, and is dealing with it in the same way that Mumbai does, which is to kind of deepen the channels, change estuaries into rivers, and manage those systems, completely change coastal systems in order to manage, rainwater and push it out into the sea. So definitely, the kinds of questions and narratives that this brings up is definitely not just India, I would say. I see this here, sitting here in Singapore, in terms of the kinds of climate readiness and the channeling and coastal systems that go into place. It's really a question about whether we can think beyond technological solutions that attend, to very, very, very development horizons that work on decadal ideas of human progress, and shift that to say, think about how do we think about a coast that we plan for 1,000 years, because that's how things like pollutants will act. Plastic will degrade over millennia. So from where do we begin to change these frameworks? I think if that is the question it asks, then it's definitely, I would say, much more broadly relevant than the city itself.
Thank you so much. I don't know
Thank
if
you.
we still have time for one last question. I don't know if anybody would like to ask a question. So this is the opportunity to talk to Chitra about the state of the fishing industry, and more specifically of small-scale fishing in coastal India. No, so please join me in thanking once again Chitra for her wonderful talk. It was really very thought-provoking, and I agree with everyone else in this room that your cartoons are just amazing. I mean,
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
everybody's incredible envious of your cartoons. We would love to be doing cartoons as well in our ethnography. It's really
But
great.
if you want to draw, you can talk to me at any time. I subscribe to the idea that anybody can draw, and that the idea that drawing has to look nice and neat is a complete falsehood. If you look at artists like Ali Brosh, who draws hyperbole in half, she draws it on Windows Paint, and it's just like very, very scritchy lines. I often show those kinds of drawings to my students to tell them, anybody can draw. It's really about the narrative and about exploring the medium. So if anyone wants to talk or has a project that they want to include drawings in or think about visuals, shoot me an email. I'll be happy to
I
talk.
will definitely do that. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
Thanks so much.
let me just remind everybody that the next Sci-Tech Asia webinar is on the 15th of March. And we're gonna move to China this time to talk about sterilization and family planning in Southwest China. And we're gonna have Tinghui Lau, also from National University of Singapore. I think it's a colleague of yours.
Yes.
Anyway, thank you once again, Chitra.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone. Thanks
Okay,
for making the
bye-bye.
time. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.